Welcome to Fritzy's Indie Spotlight, where we showcase the most innovative and excited independent game developers from around the world. I'm your host, Fritzy, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to our very first guest, Mike, the talented indie game developer behind Below the Stone. Mike's game is a masterpiece of indie game development, featuring stunning visuals, immersive sound design, and addictive gameplay. As our first guest, Mike embodies the creativity and innovation that drives independent game development. Throughout our conversation, we'll be exploring the inspiration behind Below the Stone, the challenges of developing an indie game with a small team, and what the future holds for Mike and his studio. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mike to Fritzy's Indie Spotlight.
I'm Mike Strollart, the director and artist on Below the Stone, and I've been working on this project for about 3.5 years now. So it's been quite a while, but there's a lot to be said about it.
Yeah, so what's the general concept of Below the Stone?
So it started with a sort of early premise of dwarves just going on these quests underground, and we wanted it to be a roguelike where somebody who's actually playing the game could actually choose what they want to bring down and what they want to risk. So usually in roguelikes, the formula is the very typical, you go into the dungeon, you see how far you get, and then you die. And then you repeat that process over and over and over and over again until you get good at the game, then eventually you beat it. So that's like the typical roguelike formula you generally see in games. But we wanted to make something a little different where the player themselves could actually choose what they brought down with them and choose how much risk they wanted to take on themselves. So we wanted to make it so every time you go down, you're actually risking the equipment you are wearing and all the equipment that you crafted. So every time you go down, you're risking all the stuff from your previous adventures that you decided to bring with you this time around.
Right.
And all that stuff on you is actually important for the run in how deep into these caves, into these mines, how deep below the stone you can get.
Right, it's kind of like that risk versus reward gameplay we've seen in other
Yep.
titles, and kind of really, I've seen people really grip onto that. Is there anything that's different in your thought process of risk versus reward when thinking about mechanics for Below the Stone?
Well, one of the things we wanted to do was not only doing the formula where we're actually allowing people to craft their equipment and actually choose what kind of equipment they want to bring, but we wanted to make it so you could choose the kind of class and multi-class a little bit every time you go down. So again, in roguelikes, what's very typical is what you'll see is you'll have, the five or six characters that you can play, and you get to get a special ability or two for every character you bring down into whatever roguelike challenges you happen to be going through. In this, we wanted to make it so you could truly customize your character to whatever needs you wanted during whatever run you were doing. So you could do sort of a mage warrior kind of combo. You can do various kind of things and various setups. It's very inspired by games like Terraria and
Right.
Enter the Gungeon and Deep Rock Galactic. Imagine those games, but if they made a baby, that's kind of below the stone.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So it's like not really like your traditional risk versus reward, but more like prepping for the kind of mission that you're wanting to do with the kind of reward that you're
Yeah.
trying to gain in the process. That's really interesting. I've been reading
Yep.
through the game description a bit more this time around, and I got to play it a little bit at PAX West. But I saw stuff about biomes and resources available. Could you maybe share about what kind of biomes you have, or what you're planning, and what kind of the resources look like? And maybe that'd be a
Oh,
great
yeah. So
segue to also explain the crafting system that y'all have created or are creating.
no, yeah, yeah. So what we have planned, and this is usually the thing that really catches people off guard, is a lot of people when we say we're planning on having 50 biomes, they're usually kind of shocked by that because they always see games where it's like, oh, we have 10 biomes or something. So when they see a game where we're promising 50 plus biomes, people usually get really shocked by that. But at the same time, I think it's important for roguelikes to make them all very, very. You're playing this when you're playing a roguelike, you're doing this formula where you're kind of going in this gameplay loop over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And the thing is, the great weakness with roguelike sometimes is that it gets too formulaic, it gets too repetitive. Like, okay, yeah, I've seen that enemy before. Oh yeah, I've seen this thing before. I've seen and we want to make it so you're playing and you could be 100 hours into the game and there might be a rare creature or a rare biome that you've just never seen before, and it feels like you're kind of exploring something new every time you're playing the game. And we wanted to make it feel that every biome you're going into is very they vary in hazards and creatures and the resources you can find there. So and that's difficult to balance too, right? So imagine trying to balance 50 different areas with all these different kinds of resources and all these different kinds of enemies, and it's hard for a small team, right?
I
But at
imagine
the same
so. Yeah.
time, I mean, right now our team is 6 people, and that's the biggest our team's ever been.
Hmm.
We for the longest time it was two of us and then three of us, a programmer, a main artist, and a musician. And then since then we've slowly expanded. And when you look at games, like I said before, we're kind of inspired by games like Terraria and Deep Rock Galactic, and a lot of these games have like a team of like at least a dozen people. So we're kind of shooting pretty far with the moon with this, but at the same time, I think we're capable of doing it. We're very capable of doing it. And the thing I found is that's generally like the big challenge when it came to developing Below the Stone. It's we have a big dream and a very big project here with a very small team, but a lot of it is something that I think we can accomplish. Is just going to take the time to do it.
Right. Yeah. I've talked to a couple of studios. They call that like swinging above their kind of weight class, and it's always. I think
Yeah.
it's cool to be ambitious and to create those systems personally. Uh,
Yeah.
so what kind of biomes do you have created so far?
Oh yeah. So generally, well, right now we have the various sort of general biomes you would
Hmm.
see in caves. You have your different like you have your hazardous magma biomes, your what we call the deep swamp biome. We have a sinkhole biome where the actual cave roof has collapsed and you
Oh,
see
cool.
a little bit of the surface kind of lingering in the caves. You'll see like cave bears and deer and little things that kind of like happen to fall through from the
Hmm.
surface. We also have plans for various like magical themed biomes, electrical crystals that offer their own various hazards and things that you can use them for. So these, what's planned is we have this electric crystals biome, and we wanted to use these as almost like fantasy themed batteries for power drills that dwarves would use while they're mining. So there's little thematic things like that we're doing, and as you're going down, you're going to see more. And this is the thing that gets me excited. As you're on the first layers of the cave, it's the generic stuff you might imagine a cave being. But as you go deeper, it starts to get like more and more alien, and it's like environments that you almost like when you go into deep parts of the ocean,
Right.
you start to see life that's almost like alien to us. It doesn't make sense to us
Hmm.
as like land creatures, right? But as you go deeper, these things haven't seen light and they haven't interacted with surface creatures for so long that they're in their own environment. So as you're going deeper, it becomes more alien, it becomes more strange, and we wanted that to kind of be the thing that you encounter as you go deeper and darker into these caves.
Oh, that's really cool. So, like, just yeah, no, I kind of see your vision on creating those like unique creatures and kind of more like alien stuff. That's really neat.
Mhm.
So, in terms of like you mentioned like crystals for electrical properties and other things, do you how do you envision the crafting system and what have y'all created with that?
So far, we have like the very in this demo that we're putting together, we have the very basic crafting of various
Hmm.
armors and weapons, but we plan on making it so as you're going further into the game, there's actually more about combining these things into larger and more elaborate crafting recipes. So again, inspired very much by Terraria. There's
Hmm.
there's a lot of like end game gear which requires you to craft various things all in a line and combine these things into something really strong.
Right.
So what we have in mind is we want to have various like gem slots that you can use to improve your character's abilities, whether it's magic or fighting or being tanky or mining even, luck based gems,
Hmm.
so various enchantments. So it's not just crafting; it's also these things which will also buff your character during these runs. And you got to imagine also at the same time, as I'm mentioning all this stuff, you're risking this during these runs. So every time you're going into these caves with all these unique things that you crafted, you're using this almost like a scuba diver. You're wearing this as your
Right.
thing to descend, right? In order to survive to descend. And the only way for you to survive is with everything that you built up. But at the same time, when you go down there and you're alone and you're fighting these really powerful creatures, you could lose all of that progress that you chose to bring down with you in one run, and you're starting back where you were before. So, this all kind of ties together in like a big system where we really want to amplify the risk and reward thing. And one thing I've had people ask is like, what if people get like really angry at your game? Like, what if people get really pissed off at this one day and they just decide not to play anymore? What I've said in response to that is I've seen people who like while they're playing like Darkest Dungeon, right? That's another game that's a big inspiration for Below the Stone. This idea of as you go deeper, it gets more and more dangerous. In Darkest Dungeon, I've seen people smash their keyboards and totally their keyboard's broken in half, right? And
Right.
the next day they buy a new keyboard and they start playing the next day, right?
Yeah.
That's because you were so invested in this game that you were playing. You were so in the zone with this game that breaking your keyboard made sense to you at the time. You were just so angry at this game that you just broke your keyboard over your knee and you decided, well, I love this game so much, I'm going to buy a new keyboard and keep playing it. You
Yeah,
know,
it's an
it's
emotional like investment too, even if that
yeah,
emotion might
you're
be anger at the
exactly.
time. Yeah, no, that's
You're
awesome.
you're so immersed. You're so immersed in what's happening. I mean that's literally what it's like to be a gamer, right? It's like you're
Hmm.
throwing a controller across a room. It's like these are the things I remember growing up, and I don't think people should necessarily shy away from this. That's a hot take, but I don't think game developers should shy away too much from that because that, like I said, that's really what it's like to play video games. Like I'm sure you've had those moments.
Right.
Whoever's listening to us who had those moments, and I think that's just kind of the cool thing about playing video games. So there's a reason why we get so immersed in them.
Yeah, that I play a lot of mill sim. I play everything, but I play a lot of
Yeah.
like mill sims, like Escape from Tarkov, and like totally
Oh
get
yeah,
get
that
like
perfect
super
example.
mad at it, and then I'll be done for a few days. But I always go back to it because it's just like
Yeah.
games that have that risk reward thing. There's something there that kind of excitement and that gear fear with it. It does add like another like
Oh
emotional
yeah. I mean,
mix to the game.
I have buddies who play Tarkov. I played DayZ for years, and
Right.
that was kind of like, I mean, if you're talking about like games that just beat you over the head over and over
Hmm.
and over again when you play them, like, but you still coming back. These are the kind of games that we play, and like I kind of want to with Below the Stone. There's something with life in general with that, right? Where there's always like a risk and reward kind of thing going on, and I think that with our video game monkey brains, our reptile brains, that it kind of like tickles it in the right place where
Hmm.
you're just playing these games, and I think there's something to it that's pretty deep with just humans in general. So I think there's no reason to shy away from like, oh well, we should go easy on people and add an easy mode to the game where you don't lose anything. Then you kind of lose the fun when you win every time, right?
Right.
So that's why these games where you get gear fear, your adrenaline's running when you get into like an encounter, right? And that's kind of the thing I want to create a little bit with Below the Stone. I want to boil that down to its most potent form and have that be kind of the game.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to make for some great gameplay. So you've mentioned a lot about the gear kind of being your investment portion and kind of driving what you can and can't do in the dungeon. Do y'all have any kind of soft skill system or plans for a soft skill system that's like character specific, almost like a kind of some RPG elements?
Oh yeah, so one of the things we want to do also, I've been mentioning the player side of things this whole time. Um, so regarding like soft skills, um, having like a skill tree necessarily, we're gonna shy away from something like that. We want
Mm-hmm.
to actually do it where, as you're going into these caves, you're actually building this sort of kingdom, this hub area back at home. So every time you go into these caves, there's this hub area that you return to where you do all your crafting, your resource management, all your stuff. And you get to store any extra gear you find. You get to craft new armor with the stuff you bring back. So it's where you do all your general tasks. Again, kind of like Tarkov, where every time you come back, there's like a return kind of place where you get to interact with various NPCs. And one of the things we want to do is when you go down on these descents in the caves below the stone, we wanted to make it so occasionally you might find a new NPC down there that you get to bring back. And if you bring him back, you'll actually be able to get new recipes, new things you can purchase. So every time you go down, there's a chance that you can bring something new back, whether, like I said, whether it's an
Right.
NPC that brings new crafting, new tools, new things that'll help you even more on your next trip. So imagine, like again, your example of Tarkov. Imagine if every time you go down, there's this chance where, as you're entering, you can bring back an NPC that can actually help you on your next run, like a new
Right.
shopkeeper that can actually give you new stuff, new scopes, or new whatever, right? And that'll help you during your next run when you're playing that game. So that's what we wanted to do with Below the Stone. So
Yeah.
again, a little bit inspired by Terraria, where there's like NPCs that come and join your thing. A little inspired by Enter the Gungeon, but we wanted to make it more involved, where these guys are really important. They're not just like an optional thing. This is something where you're actually able to brew new potions. You're able to do new magic items. You're able to enchant. So all these things during these descents will like everything that you've done in the early game is going to compound to the late game. So all that
Yeah.
armor, all that stuff you crafted, all the resources, all that time you took is going to compound all the way to the end game of Below the Stone.
Yeah, it's a really cool, interesting way to kind of do progression for a roguelike. I think it's pretty cool. So, what are your plans in regards for maybe co-op or online play, or is it going to be strictly single player? I don't know. I couldn't remember exactly if y'all had mentioned that when I met with you before.
So this is like one of the big questions we
Mm-hmm.
always get, because they always see the poster and they see the two dwarves on the poster and they're like, okay, that means multiplayer, right? And one of the things was in the early days, we and on that poster on our artwork, we only had one dwarf
Mm-hmm.
before, and there were so many people who were saying, "Oh, I would love to see multi. I want to play this with my girlfriend. I want to play this with my roommate. I want to play this with my family, my daughter, my son. You know, everybody wants to play this with somebody else." So eventually, I was like, "Well, let's test this out real quick." So I made a poster design with two dwarves on it, and I wanted to see how many people like, like a little trick of, just to see
Right.
what people's response was. And people were like, "Oh my god, this is going to be multiplayer, right? This is and like everybody was like super ecstatic." And then I decided, and it was like, okay, it is so clear to us that people want multiplayer. People
Mm-hmm.
want multiplayer so badly for this game. So what we've decided is, as we go into early access, we want to actually start focusing on multiplayer content. So at first, we're going to focus on the single player content, let that stew, make sure we get everything balanced. And then as we go into early access and once we start moving things in, I think then is the time we're going to focus on multiplayer and actually start adding this content. So in the meantime, we're going to be doing a single player experience.
Mm-hmm.
But as we develop more, we want to make sure this is a really good multiplayer game. Like I said, everybody says they want to play with their girlfriend, their roommate, their daughter, their son. Everybody looks at this game and they see a person that's going to either be next to them on the couch playing, or somewhere, on Steam or just in a Discord call, just playing the game with somebody else. So I think that's become our goal at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a great goal to have. I see some like projects get really ambitious for that co-op play, and they kind of like backseat the actual content of it, and
Yeah.
it just kind of flops and it's not good. I think y'all have good priorities on that, and I think that this kind of game style does act in well to a kind of a co-op experience. I think that y'all have a lot of success going that route. So at the moment, is there any like story or lore behind Below the Stone, or anything that y'all are working on, or kind of like a backstory?
So we do. Now, I don't want to get too spoilery right now,
Yeah.
but of course, one of the things I've thought of was with Below the Stone. The thing was, we had general ideas of what we wanted the game to be, and we didn't quite have a villain for Below the Stone. And one of the things we talked about was there are various themes we thought about. One idea was, oh, maybe we can do like a necromancer. Like every time you're descending in these caves, this necromancer's like growing his power, like using all the individuals who risk their lives to grow his army or something like that, right? And we decided, okay, necromancer is kind of almost something, but we weren't quite 100% sure with it. But one day I had thought of something a little new, and it was something where perhaps there's an entity deeper in these mines. Perhaps there's a reason why every time you go into them, they're twisting in new forms. There's new creatures you find down there and resources. Perhaps there's something down there that's luring you in, enticing you with these resources. And we wanted to have a villain that was specifically designed for Below the Stone, not something that was just an idea that's, oh, let's just create a villain that's kind of like a big demon or like, oh, the devil because he's at the center of the earth or whatever. Let's create something that's specifically a villain for Below the Stone. And we had thought Necromancer was close. A creature which symbolizes the earth and a necromancer at the same time. Something that plays with the idea of when you die, you get buried. When you die, you get like this necromancer is using his power to grow. And perhaps this cave that the dwarves have found is a pinnacle, like a point where this creature, this entity is forming. And this creature is almost using this cave that the dwarves have found as like a point where he's growing his power to become more and more and more powerful. So right now we have an idea for this creature that the player will eventually find deep in the mines below the stone.
That's awesome. It's almost kind of like a druid necromancer to the earth kind of thing. It's different, which people like different, right? I think you kind
No,
of hit the nail on the head. People are a little old to the same kind of repetitive, kind of like main villains types. So like coming up with a creative solution that fits your title is really awesome.
that was one of the things that we thought of when we were actually designing this villain. So and we're gonna actually have some concept artists putting something together for it. So yeah, we're gonna see what we come up with that.
So in terms of development and your development process, what would you say has been the most challenging part of developing a game with on a small team of six, like you said?
Well, obviously, immediately when you're talking about a small team, and believe me, there are smaller teams too that have to deal with even more problems like this. But scope creep is obviously a big problem. We've been lucky enough not to have to encounter something like that. But with a game like Below the Stone, it's very big, just naturally speaking, with everything that we're trying to do. Like I said, typically when you see a game like this, there's usually a pretty large team working on it. Where, like I said, there's 50 biomes. There's all these different creatures that need to be programmed, all the different AI for all these different creatures, all the assets need to be made for these things. And one of the things I really don't like doing in video games, and I'm sure you've seen it before, the typical MMO style where whenever you see an enemy, you see the green slime when you're in the fur zone.
Uh,
And then when you go in later, it's, oh, there's the blue slime. Oh, it's
it's
super
reskinned,
dangerous. And
yeah.
then, yeah, and then there's a red slime. Oh my God. It's like, it's just a reskinned enemy. We've already seen it before. We want to make it so every time you enter a new place, it feels like a new place. It's not just a reskin. It's not just a, you've seen this thing before. It's actually a new enemy. It's actually a new creature, and all these things sort of tie together into making it so every time you play the game, it's something new, it's something fresh. Every time you load up the game, you can play like a 5 hour session, and then the next day you're playing again, and you see something completely new. And then you do that again the next day, you see something completely new again. It's every time you play, you're seeing these new things. And again, that's something that kind of lacks in roguelikes a lot of times. And it does take a lot of work to get there. But I think that work is really worth it, and especially when we start to talk about things like multiplayer and wanting to invite your friends to play, all this stuff is super worth doing, because why else would you want to invite somebody to play a game like this? If it's just the same thing over and over again, why invite your roommate to play it, right? Why invite your son or daughter to play with you? We want to make this game really fun, and we want to make it so when you do decide to invite your roommate or whomever with you to play, you can decide, well, oh wait, Billy, I've never actually seen this creature before. I don't know how to handle this yet.
Right.
So every time you're playing, it's just something completely new, and that's really what we want to do with Below the Stone.
That's cool. That's also enticing to get people to keep playing and progressing because it's like, oh, you're gonna
Yeah.
see new enemies, new challenges, not the same reskin. That's really cool. A lot of time you've probably been asked like, what do you like about development on an indie style game? I'm gonna ask you, what do you dislike about working on an indie
That's a
game?
good question. That is a good question. I think and this is a spicy one. This is definitely a spicy question. So I think the one thing I just generally don't like is usually when you're working on a game, and this is something that to a lot of people might seem like a good thing, but I think when you're working in a creative field, being able to step outside once in a while is nice, right? And I think as a game developer, you're inside a lot of the time, usually in the same office room, usually same four walls, and you're usually working on the same thing every day. With games, you these are like hyper passion projects for a lot of people. And because there are these hyper passion projects for a lot of people, it's not just like a painting, you can get it done in like a couple weeks or whatever, or a couple days. It's something that you're working on for a really long time. So your passion has to be really in what you're working on right now. So, and I've never lost that passion with Below the Stone. But with game development in general, it's just very hard. Sometimes when you sit down at your desk and you're like, all right, it's time to work. You drink your coffee, you drink whatever caffeinated beverage you need to focus on work. And then like ideas, it's almost like writer's block. Sometimes the ideas just don't flow that day. And you're like, oh man, okay, well, maybe it's time to just do some UI design stuff for now for today. Everybody's ecstatic about UI design. Yay! That's the one thing with game development that I don't like.
Yeah.
So it's
Okay.
usually like the tediousness of certain things. So yeah,
All right. Thanks for answering that. And
yeah,
I guess some
yeah.
fun questions too. So, like, if you were to have a celebrity voiceover for Below the Stone, who would you have
Oh
as a
man.
celebrity and why?
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. So who was um I think, I'm a big fan of Tom Kenny. I
Tom Kenny.
think,
Okay.
yeah, so SpongeBob,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think he would be a good voice. Um, so there's also, uh, who was the voice for Mr. Krabs? Clancy Brown.
Okay.
He was in Shawshank Redemption as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the old cartoons I
Some
watched
'90s, early
would, yeah,
2000s
some
voice
some yeah,
actors. Yeah.
I think that would be cool. Um, you know, when I think about celebrity voice actors, I always think of like something I've seen when I was a kid, and I think like, okay, when somebody's playing this game, I would love to like. I always try to recreate the feeling that I felt when I was a kid with something when I'm playing a game or when I'm watching a show or whatever. And I know somebody out there. It's almost like sending a signal to other people out there in
Yeah.
the world. Like, okay, I know somebody out there is gonna like this. They're gonna catch on to this. So I think I would like to have a voice actor like that play a role in
Right.
a game like this.
I think Gerald Butler would be a good Dorf voice.
Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
think I
that would
think he
actually,
would have.
yeah,
He's got the nice rough
like kind of the gruff
accent. Yeah.
voice of a dwarf. Yeah.
Can you tell me about a feature or element of the game that you thought was going to be really cool, but like it turned out not being a good idea or decision?
Okay, this is an okay. This was a See, these are the kind of questions that hit hard too, because I you don't get to talk about them too much. Usually, it's the happy things. So one of the things I early on we were considering was, and we talked about this for weeks too. We thought that, and the problem becomes a little obvious as it's being described. But one of the ideas early on was how can we make it so somebody can stop playing one day while in the middle of a session, like while in the middle of a journey in the caves? And what we were thinking was, okay, maybe the player can like bring a tent with them in the caves, and they can use this to like camp, and that'll be like a save state almost, like while you're mid journey. But we thought to ourselves, okay, that's kind of a neat idea, but it adds a lot of problems where we have to, whereas before we did not need to save the current like level structure. So like every time the caves generate in Below the Stone, it's a completely new cave system. Every time you go in, it's completely different from the last one you went in. And the only thing they might share is like occasionally there's a familiar biome or various enemies that are similar. So when you go into the caves, we'd have to make it so if you could save mid journey, we'd have to make it so it save all this information, and
Right.
we'd have to remember all this stuff for the next time you log in. And we said, okay, again, neat idea, but it adds a lot of problems rather than making things easy on us. So we said, okay, it might make more sense for us to simply say, okay, if you're mid run, it'll give you like a warning if you decide to log out or whatever. You can pause the game, but if you need to like just quit the game, it might be better for us to just create like a warning pop up that says like, "Hey, if you decide to quit while mid run, you will lose your equipment or whatever."
Right.
Something like that to kind of tie that in a little bit, so that way it's not like this huge endeavor for us to accomplish all this stuff just to
Right.
facilitate this maybe situation. But yeah, I think something like that was an early idea. And sometimes like as you're developing a game, you have a lot of little ideas like that where it's like, oh well, maybe we can solve this problem by simply doing this thing, and then you realize simply doing this thing ends up like becoming like this avalanche where it's like a little pebble at first, it's growing bigger and bigger, and it's like creating more and more and more problems as it stampedes down the hill. I think
Right.
that's a
Right.
big thing with game development where little ideas sometimes have big implications long term, and you still have to build more on it. So usually when it comes to making a game, we have to be very careful to avoid those instances where those things happen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny because when you mentioned the idea that you had, I have like my head goes to like trying to like it tries to solve what a problem, and I'm really bad about it
Yeah.
because I'll like cut people off sometimes. My head went to, oh, it probably would have ruined the whole balance of the game because now you have a save point where if you die, you can just knife it and go back to the save point on your
Yeah,
little tainted
exactly.
site. So, but y'all, your problem was more from a design issue where like, oh, we got these generative maps, and then it's like, okay, we got this seed, and then we're gonna store all this data. And that's really,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting way to like approach it. That's awesome. What advice would you give to any kind of aspiring indie game developer or creator based off the knowledge you've gained from this project?
So I think generally one of the things I had learned early on with Below the Stone was there's a lot of aversion when you're creating something artistic, when you're kind of putting yourself out there. Um, and maybe you felt this a little bit too. Sometimes when you're first thinking about putting yourself out there in the world, sometimes you think to yourself, "Oh, maybe this doesn't work, or maybe I have to improve this some way before I show anybody this thing."
Hmm.
Um, I find generally putting yourself out there is always a good move because I've seen so many people who want to be game developers, and what they want to do is they try to achieve perfect before doing it. And this is something I remember. Of all people, I remember watching a YouTube video, like a very short clip of
Hmm.
like Mr. Beast. He was talking about starting a YouTube channel, and I don't plan on starting like a big YouTube channel or anything, but I was interested in what he had to say about this. But he was like, whenever you're starting a YouTube channel, don't just wait for it to happen. Start doing it and then
Hmm.
make little improvements along the way. Um, and one of and I think that applies to game development too. What we did was with the first Below the Stone Kickstarter, we had thought, well, the game isn't complete yet. This is a very like early prototype game, and I was very much willing to push to actually put it out there. And one of the things that we did was, well, we decided, okay, well, there's crowdfunding, and we could do a Kickstarter, and we could put together a trailer for it. Ended up doing all this prep work to put a trailer together and everything. And at first, we actually failed this Kickstarter. We didn't actually get the funding for Kickstarter. We set a goal of $10,000, which is a big chunk of money, but for developing a game, that can get spent very fast when you
Yeah.
have multiple people. When you have multiple artists, when you have multiple people all working together, $10,000, again, big. Everyone would wish they had $10,000 in their pocket at any point, but at the same time, when you're working on a game, that gets spent so fast. So what we did was we set that $10,000 goal. We only hit a goal of 5,000. So with Kickstarter, it does not get the funding. But what we realized from this was, despite failing the Kickstarter, we still had hundreds of fans that were willing to donate to this project. And they
Right.
joined our community, they joined our Discord and everything. And these people stuck around because they loved what they saw. And eventually, we ended up seeing publishers messaging us after seeing the Kickstarter. Like, even though the Kickstarter didn't work, publishers started messaging us and were like, hey, we're interested in this game. In fact, that's how we met Apogee, so our current publisher. So with Below the Stone, Apogee decided, this looks pretty cool. Let's talk with these guys. So then, we ended up getting a publisher with Apogee. So that was a really cool move. And, just putting yourself out there to the world is never a bad idea. And you get to learn things as you go along, and you shouldn't be shy about it. Just put your artwork out there, put your project out there, and see what people like about it. See what people say about it, and people will give you ideas for your game as well. So like when we put Below the Stone out there, there are people who are like, "Oh, this looks like Motherload, or this looks like Terraria, or this looks like
Hmm.
this game," and we'd look up those games and be like, "Oh yeah, they're kind of right," and we get a little inspiration here and there from people. A lot of people would tell us what they loved about the game, and we're like, "Okay, yeah, let's focus on that a little bit. Let's focus on what people love about the game." So and these same people are still around to this day. All those people that saw us from our first Kickstarter are still with us today. So just put yourself out there, and you can't possibly lose. Sorry if that was long winded,
No,
but
no, it's
I thought
perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, and you kind of said I could probably resonate with a little bit of that too, because like when trying to get myself into more of the gaming industry personally, I'm trying to look at like what I can do, what skills I have, what I've done, and a lot of the time, and advice I've gotten from others, if you just like prep and try to like knock all these certificates on top of each other, you try to like stack everything up, but you don't actually produce, you don't actually do anything, you're not really moving anywhere. And
Yeah.
being able to put yourself out there and take criticism and not like let that shut you down, but in fact let inspire you to keep pushing is really great. And I mean,
Yeah.
I appreciate your insight on that. Overall, for the sake of the interview, I don't really have any more questions. You've been fantastic, Mike.
Thank
So
you.
I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. Is there any last minute things or anything you'd like to note?
Well, first, I'd like to say I appreciate this interview too. That being able to talk about this stuff, it's always like a gift. I'm able to tell people about the stuff I learned about the little things that challenged us with Below the Stone. We get to talk with people who get to listen to this, um, and we both you and I get to talk too. From
Mm-hmm.
PAX, so it's always cool to be able to be able to talk about the things you love in life. And for me, that's Below the Stone. So, I really appreciate doing this interview. Um, and I suppose, if you want to reach out to or find out more about the
Mm-hmm.
game, you can look us up on strollart.com or belowthestone.com.
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure we have all your links and stuff on the video. So for
Thank
people
you.
that watch the video at the bottom, they'll be able to see your Steam page, your website, your Discord, and stuff like that.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
All right, Mike. It's been a pleasure. I really do appreciate it.
Me too. I
All
appreciate
right.
it. Thank you.
Yeah, you have a good one. Another huge shout out to Mike, and just awesome to get to connect to him and see like his progress from how his games come from even as soon as last September. So just really cool to reconnect with him. And thank you guys for watching. And if you are an indie game developer that's out there and you want to get a spotlight on your game, reach out. I mean, contact me on YouTube through the DMs. I'll have my Discord and other links at the bottom. Also, be sure to catch out all of the links for Below the Stone at the bottom and like and subscribe. Until next time, y'all have a good time.